I'm talking about their first meeting that took place when Donald J. Trump was still a president-elect. Shinzo Abe went to New York's Trump Tower and took an elevator to the uppermost floor penthouse. And when the elevator opened, Shinzo Abe saw an entire whole family members of Mr. Trump. So when you speak about Japan opening doors to foreigners or immigrants and so on and so forth, whether Japan is xenophobic or not, you're basically talking about the Chinese, because 25% of the foreigners are from mainland China. In other words, we are witnessing an increasing number of Chinese communist cells spreading across Japan.
Welcome, Studio Asians. Our major topics today. Is Japan's security situation actually worse than Taiwan's? The strategic importance of Taiwan for Japan's security interests. Daily Chinese military intrusions around the Senkaku Islands. The relationship between Japan and Taiwan despite economic ties binding Tokyo to China. The dynamics between leaders like Abe, Trump, and Duterte. Welcome to the show.
Hi everyone. Today our guest is Tomohiko Taniguchi. He was before with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as Deputy Press Secretary, Deputy Director General for Public Diplomacy. Then he worked with the Prime Minister's office as a special advisor to Prime Minister Abe's cabinet and his primary foreign policy speechwriter. Now he is with the University of Tsukuba as a specially appointed professor. Good day, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Because most people outside of Asia think that probably Taiwan would be the coming flashpoint. But from the data and research I saw here in Taiwan, actually Japan has more aerial intrusions, at least last year, and also is threatened, unlike Taiwan, just from one enemy, is threatened by three: Russia, North Korea, and China. So could you please elaborate a little bit on Japanese current situation?
Taiwan is not a small entity. It is as big as Ireland, Northern and Main Ireland put together. So put yourself into the shoes of British, if you like, and then think Taiwan or Ireland under the dominance of Chinese Communist Party. How would you feel? What sort of situation would you find yourself in? That's one thought exercise I have urged my friends coming from Europe or the UK. Japan's strategic space is going to be extremely narrow if Taiwan gets annexed by China. So, annexation of any kind, peaceful, whatever, is not going to be good for Japan's national interest. Status quo is what the Japanese national interest desires. As you say, Japan is among very few nations in the world facing not only China but also North Korea and Russia. Mind you, when Chinese Communist Party's PLA has chosen to invade in Taiwan or going to military options, at the same time, you will see North Korean cyber warriors making a lot of intrusions in the systems of Japan, Taiwan, and elsewhere. And Russia, of course, is going to provoke militarily the northern front of Japan and the US Japan alliance. Simultaneous breakout is something that you should be prepared for.
And also, I think you're still dealing with the constant intrusions around the Senkakus, right? That's an additional problem you have to deal with.
Certainly. Well, it's been a daily phenomenon since way back in 2008. Each and every day, we see Chinese official vessels entering into Japan's waters, either contiguous waters or territorial. So far, Japanese National Coast Guard ships have been doing a lot in blocking them from entering the Japanese territorial waters, but the Chinese Coast Guard is almost like a navy as regards its number of ships and in terms of the size of the guns they equip themselves. So it's very much a serious situation.
I like so much you used the term annexation before, which is correct. Very few people do that, almost no one, but that's the correct term, not unification. I wanted to ask you then about Senkaku, still one follow up question. Because we hear about Taiwan, we hear about the Philippines. Why isn't this topic in the media? Why doesn't your government bring this up that you're being constantly threatened by China? This used to be a topic in the news a decade ago, but not anymore.
About a decade ago, one fishing boat from China made an elaborate collision with one Japanese Coast Guard ship. And that caused a lot of problems between China and Japan. And after that, the private owner of those islands gave up his property rights, and those property rights were transferred to the state. The Chinese became very much furious about this, and those were the times when you recall that there was a row. But it is not news, ironically, because it is a daily phenomenon. And secondly, it is the discipline and the skill levels of the Japanese Coast Guard that has been successfully waving off the intruding Chinese boats. Had it not been for this much skilled discipline you can see exhibited by the Japanese Coast Guard, there might have been a number of collisions. There would have been a very much dangerous situation. Fortunately, this has not been the case, and therefore, ironically, this has not been a source of news.
One more question regarding Taiwan and Japan, because not many people know that outside of Taiwan, but actually, Taiwan was a colony of Japan, and still both countries are very, very, very close. And Taiwanese like Japan so much; they study the language. Basically, all Taiwanese, from what I can tell, they either have been to Japan or are going to visit Japan. And I once had this idea that actually, if given the choice, Taiwanese would probably prefer much more to, if they had to choose who they would have to be a part of, rather Japan than China. And actually, I found an opinion poll a decade ago that yes, somebody actually checked it, and Taiwanese feel much closer to the current Japan than to the current China. Could you please talk a little bit about the relationship between those both countries?
The relationship has been extremely warm. I know there have been mixed emotions among the Taiwanese towards Chiang Kai-shek, but it took the Chiang Kai-shek's leadership and brevity who gave up their right to get compensation, financial compensation about the colonial rule from Japan. And my father's generation has been extremely humbled by that. If you say to older generations of the Japanese, what did you make of Chiang Kai shek's gesture? They would say, we were extremely humbled. And it took such a leadership.
Studio Asia is an independent channel. I am neither looking for sponsors, nor asking you for donations. I value much more your comment under this interview. It means a lot to me, a lot. Subscribing and sharing helps me to be promoted by YouTube. I will appreciate it very, very much.
Okay, let's try again with Chiang Kai-shek. Sorry for that.
Okay, well, Chiang Kai-shek after the war decided to give up their innate right to demand wartime compensation, colonial compensation from Japan. And my father's generation was extremely humbled and grateful for the gesture. And I know that there have been mixed emotions and feelings among the Taiwanese about the leader, but that set the tone for very much amicable relationship that would ensue between Taiwan and Japan. More recently, when Kobe was hit by a major earthquake in 1995, many nations gave a lot of help to Japan. But mind you, it was only from Taiwan. Female sanitary goods, babies' diapers came to Japan. And many in Japan were extremely touched by such generous and thoughtful gesture that came only from Taiwan. And that would be repeated yet again and again whenever Japan underwent major earthquakes, tsunami, and so on. And vice versa recently, when Taiwan's also been hit by many earthquakes and natural disasters. And it is also from Japan, a lot of assistance helped by ordinary citizens uh, went to Taiwan. So recently, I think the two nations, peoples in both nations, have been bonded together by pure and genuine goodwill.
Yes, that looks the same here from Taiwan. Really very good and friendly and really honest relationship between both countries. Thank you very much for that. I would now to discuss Asia a little bit broader. Like I know Prime Minister Abe had a close relationship with Trump, but also with President Duterte. So maybe you could talk a little bit how this went and how come he had such a good understanding with both leaders.
President Duterte was very much a shoot from the hip, straight talker. And he has been targeted by Western media as someone who does things with or without regard to legal framework. Shinzo Abe chose not to do anything like a preacher. Mr. Abe sat down together with President Duterte and paid keen interest to whatever President Duterte would have to say. The same went with other major and difficult leaders, including President Donald J. Trump. Donald Trump insisted that Shinzo Abe should come alone by himself. I'm talking about their first meeting that took place when Donald J. Trump was still a president elect. Shinzo Abe went to New York's Trump Tower and took an elevator to the uppermost floor penthouse. And when the elevator opened, Shinzo Abe saw an entire whole family members of Mr. Trump's. So Mr. Trump found Mr. Abe to be politically courageous. He paid absolutely no interest in, let's say, what the headlines of major U.S. newspapers or TV broadcasting stations had been saying about Donald Trump. And that was the good beginning. And for Abe, whether Mr. Trump, whoever is president of the United States, doesn't actually matter. Because for the leader of Japan, it is always important have a good rapport with the leader of the United States. And the same went with President Duterte. The Philippines were finding it extremely difficult to strike a good balance between China and their own interest. If you say to President Duterte, you're a bad guy, you're a villain, you're like a head of the organized crime, those are the things that Western media wanted to say, then the outcome of which would be, okay, the Philippines would be leaning more towards China. So it's a balancing act, and I think Shinzo Abe knew very well about it.
Especially that Obama's administration and Kurt Campbell didn't treat the Philippines really seriously or really well. They screwed up during their administration. I wanted to update it a little bit and ask you about the recent summit, President Marcos and Prime Minister Kishida in Washington a month ago. What's your take on that?
I think it's extremely good. It's one of the best achievements that I have seen of late. Why? Because Taiwan sits between the Philippines and Japan. If the Philippines have come back to allying itself more firmly with the United States, you could say Taiwan is handily sandwiched between the two democratic allies of the United States. And that's going to give a strong message to Beijing. Think about what Xi Jinping would have been looking at the situation. He may have said, the Philippines, they have come back to where it was. And the United States and Japan these days are beefing up their partnerships with the Philippines. This has become more complicated. That's what Xi Jinping would have said. And that's exactly what Japan and the United States, and now the Philippines under President Marcos, wanted to achieve.
I still have two questions. One is more about the situation, China's influence in Japan. So I wanted to ask you, what's the covert influence and disinformation in Japan? Like, what is China doing? Because it has its operations all over the world, in the US, the European Union. How is it? How is the situation in Japan?
Yes, Japan has opened its doors to migrants and immigrants much wider than ever before. There has been an influx of people from abroad seeking job opportunities, seeking to obtain property holdings in Japan. Remember, 1 out of 4 is from China. So when you speak about Japan opening doors to foreigners or immigrants and so on and so forth, whether Japan is xenophobic or not, you're basically talking about the Chinese, because 25% of the foreigners are from mainland China. I would imagine a certain big proportion of those Chinese people may be registered as members of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party constitution stipulates that if you have 2 other members around you, you 3 must establish a cell, a branch office directly connected with the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, we are witnessing an increasing number of Chinese communist cells spreading across Japan. And because the Chinese are brilliant speakers of local languages, including the Japanese. So one should imagine that right before our eyes, influence operations and cognitive warfare of any sort have been happening. And Okinawa is an easy target. The Chinese authority has been inviting for some time uh, pundits of media organizations or scholars of local universities to China, and they cover everything: travel
Yeah.
expenses and food and whining and so on and so forth. And they come back to Japan and start advocate that Okinawa should be independent. There has been a streak of movement always in Okinawa demanding independence, but they've been talking about Ryukyu identity, Ryukyu independence. And I think some of them have been affiliated and under the influence of the Chinese authority. So Okinawa is an easy target. Why? Because Okinawa accommodates a huge military footprint of the United States. And in the Okinawan island chain has Senkakus or Yonaguni, which is the westernmost part of Japan, distant from Taiwan mainland only by 109 kilometers. Militarily speaking, it's a stone throws away. So that's the sort of things that are going on. And also, you get a huge number of graduate students, PhD candidates, working in cutting edge science and engineering departments across Japan. And it is the fact of the matter that without relying upon those hard-working, diligent PhD candidates who are at the same time members of the Chinese Communist Party, the Japanese major higher education institutions couldn't make both ends meet.
This is the channel where world's top experts on Asian politics and security discuss recent and future events.
From what I know, the pro-Taiwan Abe faction is also being decimated after his death in the Liberal Democratic Party. This doesn't help either, right? So this also affects the Japan-Taiwan relationship. Am I right?
Shinzo Abe was undoubtedly the champion of closer Taiwan-Japan ties. The loss of Shinzo Abe couldn't be missed more by both sides, which is the reason that there is a statue for Shinzo Abe built by the people in Taiwan. It is only in Taiwan such a statue stands. But it is more bipartisan, rest assured. With or without Mr. Abe, you get a bipartisan support over to Taiwan. And it's been supported and helped by this acute sense that if you lose Taiwan, you will lose almost everything.
Yes, especially as we know, Taiwan is just the first step and probably Japan would follow. So that's just, as we here in Asia know, that's just the beginning. And that is often lost in the West. My last question would be, what are you going to research and let's say the rest of this year and maybe next? What would be your focus 24, 25?
Because I worked closely with the late Prime Minister Abe, who advocated such concepts as free and open Indo-Pacific. And he also initiated the Quad process. And the current administration, for those matters, has been doing a commendable job. But my task is to continue to hammer out how important those initiatives have been. Now, you see, probably the change of guard once again in Washington, D.C. And people in Japan have started to argue, what if this and this happens? What if that and that happens? My task is continue to write stuff, articles, and opinion pieces, telling the world that Japan is going to be stable, and as a stable linchpin of the U.S.-led status quo, international, open, and rules-based system. And also to the domestic audience, I would have to say that it is not the United States, but it is also Japan that has the leverage point to make this part of the world, the Indo-Pacific region, more stable and more of the kind that's rules-based.
Mr. Taniguchi, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.
I have so many other explosive interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.